Welcome to Funders on Fundraising. I'm Kelly James with Education First Consulting. I've spent years inside philanthropy as a program officer, strategist, and someone who believes funders should be clear, candid, and in it for the right reasons.
And I'm Jeff McDougall. I've been raising money for mission-driven work for over 30 years and rethinking what real power looks like in our sector.
This podcast is a candid conversation about how money really moves and how we can build authentic, effective relationships between funders and fundraisers. We are co-produced by Chris Lawrence and Andrew Calloway and Decca Hussein Wetzel of Urbanist Media.
Our guest today is Michelle Shevin, a former program officer at the Ford Foundation. She's also been a strategist, a technologist, a lover of science fiction, and a club kid with an anthropology degree.
We get into everything from values and infrastructure to bad predictive models, jargon fatigue, and how funders can actually show up for the people they say they care about.
It's smart, grounded, and full of things you'll want to quote later. Let's get into it. The first question that we ask everyone is an interesting way of sort of prompting and getting into a bit more of your background is the work that you're up to right now, is that a continuation of a family tradition, or is this some grand act of rebellion against how you were raised?
Wow, great question. I would say it's the former, although no one in my family can accurately describe what it is I do for work. So It's both continuing like a philosophical and intellectual tradition while also taking the shape of something that is incomprehensible to anyone I'm related to. So as long as that meets the description, then yes, I think it is more of a continuity than a rebellion.
What was that philosophical tradition?
I think that I was raised to be an unorthodox thinker. I was raised by a medical doctor who decided early in his career to pursue alternative medicine and to eschew sort of Western allopathic medicine. And so I was raised, to question sort of dominant default assumptions and the canon or the accepted way of understanding how things work. And so, yes, I would say my career continues in that tradition, although philanthropy is not something that I was raised into.
So what were the first kicks of the can, like university and then first couple of gigs and jobs? What did you think you were going to do versus what did you end up doing?
It's a great question. I think, my earliest concepts of what I would do, putting aside like 6-year-old me wanted to be a paleontologist, 13-year-old me wanted to be a pop star.
Yeah.
After that, I started to read science fiction. And I think I thought for a while I might be a writer. But by the time I got to university, I was interested in political science and anthropology and international relations. And so it wasn't clear to me what shape that career would take. And in fact, I think I still maintain a sort of healthy detachment from sort of prescribing what my career path will look like. But it was clear to me that I would be taking on issues that were of geopolitical relevance and sort of systemic social issues. Those kinds of questions were attractive to me very early.
So systems level stuff. Are there baseline ideologies behind some of that around like how power should work or what justice looks like?
Yeah, I think I came a little bit later to academic thinking around power. That was really, I accidentally ended up in a graduate program through the U.S. military. And ironically, the U.S. military was where I started thinking critically about power. But in my sort of undergrad liberal arts training, I received what was probably like the default liberal Western thinking on the way systems work and the way systems should work. And so I began problematizing that sort of through again, the accidental context of the U.S. military and militarization and the ongoing legacy of colonialism and the military itself as a very future-focused organization, having a lot to lose and being in a position to think about, how to sustain the status quo in terms of national supremacy. So that became a really interesting lens through which to sort of critically consider how power was functioning in a way that I don't think I had been explicitly trained to do so before that.
Right. Kelly, any questions?
Well, I was going to say, I think that those reflections on power will definitely come back into our conversation. And I did want to ask, though, what do your parents and your family think you do now?
They probably understand that I give funding to nonprofit organizations. But if you ask, it'd be a great thought experiment. You should follow up with them and ask them to explain what I do. The separation between understanding what I'm interested in and then how it promulgates through philanthropic jargon is probably the gulf. I don't think that they're fluent in the sort of specific philanthropic jargon, but I think they understand that I research and then take some sort of action, which looks often a lot like funding, on topics at the intersection of technology and society.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I was like, that's still pretty good. And understand that it's connected to funding. I always remember my first day at the Gates Foundation, coming from a law firm over to the Gates Foundation. The very first day, there were so many acronyms used that I felt like I did not belong there at all, or had no idea what was maybe happening in education. And I was like, oh, that's very philanthropic now. Like that everything was turned into an acronym. So I get it.
Yeah, I think in many ways the through line, or one of the through lines of my career, is just learning to speak the jargon of different sectors and institutions. I mean, clearly, starting at grad school in the US military was like plenty of acronyms and jargon there. And then learning to translate from that into my first jobs, which were in sort of technology futurism and then open innovation ecosystems, and then into philanthropy. So it's been an interesting sort of like journey through different sectors and siloed jargon spaces, but often thinking about what are the tools we use to pursue a structurally different future. And then thinking critically about the way sort of power winds itself through that conversation.
Yeah.
Michelle, I want to come back to that idea of, systems analysis power. Obviously, that's the core of what we're up to. You mentioned science fiction. I'm wondering if there are particular authors whose dystopian views you think are relevant and you want to fight against, or utopian views are interesting and you want to pursue.
Sure. Well, I can start by saying some of what were, the most foundational influences on me. So my dad had me very early read Call Me Ishmael by Daniel Quinn. And so this idea of there being, a story that we tell ourselves as a species about sort of what we're doing here on this planet, which gets quickly to the idea of just even us as a species independent from this planet that we're on. So this idea of a separation between nature and culture was always something that I understood to be foundational. And I think that's played itself out across my career. The one author I can say I've read, I think everything they've ever published, is William Gibson. And so, who often at least gets credited with the quote, "The future is already here. It's just unevenly distributed." He's also since said, that's, you could sub in a lot of different words for future. So dystopia is already here. It's just unevenly distributed. Utopia is already here. It's just unevenly distributed, which has been really influential on me. I mean, I think my sort of spin on it is like, all things you can say about the future are true, but who are they true for and under what conditions is more of a meaningful question. And so that's, so I think those are some foundational influences. I like also the question of what dystopia am I trying to avoid? I think so often sci-fi was written to be a sort of warning or alarm bell, gets treated by certain tech innovators as a instruction manual. Minority Report by Philip K. Dick is a great example of that. And so this idea that we also, first of all, couldn't help but build toward the things that sci-fi was warning us about has loomed very large for me. But then also the idea that we need a sort of narrative or a values framework that encapsulates like the work that we're doing to try to build towards the future. And it wasn't until I got into philanthropy that I heard anyone talking explicitly about values at a high level. It was just sort of the assumption was, things are pretty good and we should sustain the status quo. And that wasn't even made explicit. But, whether I was working at the military or then consultancies that had a lot of clients in military and intelligence, it wasn't until I stepped out of that sphere, or at least stepped into philanthropy, that I saw that there was a sort of foil. There was a separate values framework. We talk about it as public interest values. And I should say the disclaimer that I'm speaking, of course, in my personal capacity today. And so it wasn't until I heard people talking, making that explicit, that I realized like, oh, that's what was missing for me in my early career, was kind of the idea of just, what is this all for? Technology, great, but to what end?
I understand what you mean. My first experiences professionally were in the startup world around MMOs and virtual goods. And we were doing it all in 1998, which made us think that in 1920 that we were rock stars. But of course, we were 10 years too early, which is why it all failed. But, reflecting back on that era, as a guy pushing 50, you look at, you almost just got caught up in the idea that this is the path, this is the excitement, these are the fun problems to solve. You mentioned the idea here of public interest values. So what does public interest look like before we get into what public interest technology looks like?
Yeah, well, I think, I'd start even like more granular level, which is like, what is public? What is the public? And of course, I don't think we can point to the public as some monolith. I think the public is just the word we use to describe interdependent ecosystem of communities. And so then, of course, we get to what is a community. I think a community is just people who share stakes in something. And so what is public interest? I think it's public interest as opposed to often private interest. And so we have, I think, a sort of default values framework that prioritizes private interests, whether that's commercial interests in terms of growth, speed, scale, efficiency being sort of like the things that you must optimize for in any endeavor, that connects to the idea that private, at least in a capitalist society, we've decided that private interests are the main route through which we pursue collective goods. And I also think that we're, 50 years into what we might call a neoliberal experiment that has either failed in many ways or in which most people don't feel that their interests or their politics are adequately represented by that system. And so we've got this sort of, you might call it a narrative collapse. Some people call it a narrative collapse. You might call it a narrative vacuum, where if we're not just here to grow and consolidate wealth and power into a few hands and pursue technology for technology's sake, then like what is this human project about? We can prioritize human flourishing, and we can prioritize enabling the conditions for right relationship between communities of people who share stakes in things. And so that's sort of been the animating factor for me. You asked about public interest law. The story we tell is that in the 1960s and 70s, Ford Foundation, MacArthur Foundation, and other philanthropic organizations played an important role in a movement to building infrastructure for what we now call public interest law. And this was, the moment was that it wasn't until 1967 that you had a guaranteed right to legal representation in this country. You had like civil disobedience happening around the civil rights movement. And so there was this need to sort of transform the legal profession and the infrastructure for legal work to be, effective in a moment where we needed to protect the public, and we needed new rules to protect the public, and we needed institutions that would wake up and fight for the public interest and for specific public interest values like accountability, transparency, representation, and justice, as opposed to what we had default systems set up to do, which was to fight for private interest, growth, speed, scale, and efficiency. And we still see that latter set of values being sort of default. But what we have now as a result of that philanthropic investment and also a lot of public investment is a set of lawyers who are trained differently. So they're trained to represent the public interest. We have institutions like the NAACP and the ACLU, which expanded in that moment really robustly. We have norms around things like pro bono practice in private law firms. We have different, incentives. We have different regulations. We have a whole sort of set of what we would talk about as infrastructures that became the ground on which movements for civil rights and gender equality and environmental justice were able to agitate and advocate more effectively. And so the argument we make today is that we're in a bit of a parallel moment where it's not that just that the legal profession needs to evolve, but that we need sort of all sectors, all disciplines, and all professions to be moving differently and prioritizing public interest values more effectively. And that technology sort of creates this, it's a constant force for change that is in many ways accelerating, and that slip and slide is a way to potentially bend the arc toward justice in a new way.
Cool.
Following up there, I mean, you talk about this parallel moment, and I think sounds like somewhat from your personal perspective, but if you were to kind of think about this moment in time, what is kind of bringing you the most joy? Like, what are you excited about? And what's making you nervous or kind of sparking dread as you look into these moments?
Music brings me a lot of joy. And I think there's something really meaningful about the way that music syncs up people's brainwaves. I mean, there's research that people's brainwaves actually sync up through music and dancing. And so music and dancing are an eternal source of joy for me.
You mentioned once on a call that music story and the neon on the wall behind you relate to a youthful obsession of yours.
So the neon lights help me bring a sense of the beautiful camaraderie that can be found on a Saturday night dance floor. It's a reminder of that on a daily basis in my home.
Looking at that same sort of idea of joy, are there, and circling back to some of the stuff you said off the top around your values and your interest initially, are there parts of the field that are currently inspiring you that you think hold a lot of promise?
So we see the discriminatory impact of lots of different machine learning systems that have been trained on data, that it reflects the legacy of structural racism in this community. And that's playing out in terms of facial recognition algorithms, but also algorithms that are determining, who gets hired, who gets housing, qualifies for benefits, who is put on a watch list because they are deemed to be at risk of committing a crime or getting onto the wrong side of some public system.
Mhm.
And so there's a really, really, really dangerous thing that's happened in society, which is we've taken the last 100 years of sort of measurement and we've used these algorithms to create a map of the territory. And now through the next generation of those algorithms, we risk conflating that map for the territory itself. So basically, we take these predictions that are derived from a reductionist mathematical calculus of what the past has looked like, and we threaten to promulgate them into the future as our plans. I'm inspired by the ways communities are fighting back against that and resisting and refusing and sort of reimagining what that turn towards these algorithmic tools looks like on a lot of different levels. I mean,
Interesting.
there's interesting groups fighting it on technical legitimacy, kind of proving that you can't use technology to predict things about people's life outcomes. Twin Cities Innovation Alliance successfully fought back against a proposal to build a predictive model to flag 8-year-olds that might eventually end up in contact with law enforcement. And this
Wow.
was Minnesota, which is one of the two worst states in terms of racial disparity in school discipline. And this predictive model would have taken all that data about all of the racist decisions to criminalize students of color and would have used that to then predict which, students would eventually end up in contact with law enforcement. And the community actually said, we don't want that. And the community actually worked closely with a bunch of scholars like Arvind Narayan at Princeton, groups like the ACLU and the Council on American Islamic Relations, which were able to mount a sort of civil rights defense. And so there's now this Transforming Systems Together board.
I think that's a great example of trying to center community in some of these decisions and processes. What was your role in, developing, managing, helping to balance that power dynamic?
When I met this team, I was a tech fellow at Ford, which is a really great position that I wish every philanthropy had. At least at the time I was at Ford, it was a pretty unique role. And it's not actually a grant making role, but it's somebody who comes into the foundation to help make its program teams sort of smarter about the impacts of technology on the field that they're funding. And so you get to support grantees and you get to attend conferences and events and sort of speak on behalf of the foundation, but also listen and learn. You're treated to sort of like an everyday intellectual buffet of issues that that the foundation is working on and communities that the foundation is convening. And so I was in a very privileged position as a tech fellow when I met this team, and I wasn't immediately in a position to give them a grant, although I did when I moved into a program officer role, I was able to do that. But what I was doing with them at that time was let's do some funder education around the moment that we're in, around the moment that these communities are in. But it was often an afterthought that communities who are being most impacted by these changes in data systems should actually have a determining role when it came to determining how these systems should be designed, developed, and deployed.
You mentioned funder education, and I wanted to play with that tactically. A lot of the time, I'll be working with an organization and they're not having success securing money. And their takeaway is that the funders don't understand what they're talking about, as opposed to that they're shitty salespeople. And so I always encourage people to abandon the construct of funder education as a strategy. And I'm curious, how that played out. Do you think it was the fact that you had a Ford-related job title that allowed that to work? Or has anyone ever tried to educate you on something that you already understand? How does that play out?
Yes. I mentioned being a tech fellow at Ford. For me, that was a beautiful entry point into then becoming a funder, because it gave me 3 years to just learn from the field. And so my entire tenure as a tech fellow was very explicitly my education as a funder. On day one, as a program officer, I had $50 million I needed to grant out to the field over a very tight and on a tight timeline. And
Yep.
so being in a tech fellow position where I got 3 years where I didn't have a grant making budget, which could feel like a constraint, but actually is very freeing. It was a beautiful entry point into getting my own education as a funder. I think the advice that you're giving about funder education is sound advice. The most meaningful thing you can do in funder education is not actually like, let's teach a funder something they don't know. Funders know we should not be doing things to communities. We should be doing things with communities. The experience of my grantee becomes a cautionary tale where you don't want to be on the wrong side of history. You don't want to be a funder who's doing things to communities instead of with them.
When you're going to slip from with back into to, how does that happen? How does that show up? How do you catch yourself in those moments?
Technology moves quickly, and funders often have a bias to try to move as quickly as the technology is moving. These things don't actually operate as a binary. There's often a late mover advantage where like sitting back and seeing what happens from the people who are trying things quickly is a very strategic move to then not be able to not replicate their mistakes. Philanthropy doesn't in general move very quickly, but where it tries to, it can trade things off. Moving with communities is something that gets traded off very quickly.
Well, this might be going astray for a minute, but I feel like Ford's done something really interesting in this notion of what you say called the tech fellow, and really identifying that there is specific technical expertise. And how do you bring that technical expertise in line with what communities know and what funders know, and then like what the technical experts know? Because I think sometimes the technical experts can also have challenge translating that to like, what does that mean for grant making and some of those basics that you mentioned of beginning to understand what it means to be a good grant maker. And so taking that model and interacting with other funders to take your technical expertise that you have and build those like authentic relationships. Where do you think you've been able to do that? And where's that been more challenging?
No, I appreciate all of it. I mean, I think, first of all, I should caveat that I don't know how much technical expertise I actually have. I had to Google the word technologist to get myself to apply to be a tech fellow at Ford. Because I read this, they had put up a blog post, like why Ford is hiring technologists to join the fight for social justice. And I was like, man, this sounds amazing. But like, surely I'm not a technologist. I'm trained in anthropology and strategic planning. And yet you look at my career and every job I've had is at the intersection of technology change and social change. And so I sort of convinced myself I might be qualified enough. And it turned out I was exactly the kind of person they were looking for. This is a really interesting question of how does like expertise then play into relationships? Because in the sort of philanthropic space, we over-index on expertise and under-index on relationships.
Yeah.
And so one of the things I learned as a tech fellow is like, there's certain topics that I could bring expertise into a conversation. But the actual expertise that matters is always in the person who is experiencing the problem. Ford is a social justice funder. And so those are people who are experiencing social problems and social injustices. And those are not always the people who have the academic credentials or the fluency in certain programming languages. I often encounter the assumption that default values like efficiency are things that we should relentlessly optimize for. And nicely, like efficiency is something measurable. Relationships aren't measurable. But I would say in the work that I'm doing, relationships are the only thing to optimize for. And often relationships function as sources of friction. Sometimes there's trade-offs between prioritizing for the conditions for right relationship and prioritizing for things like speed and efficiency. But I'm always thinking about like, where are the places that relationships need to be prioritized rather than disintermediated? Because technology often has the effect of disintermediating relationship.
I want to pick up on the thread in Kelly's questions around authenticity and also coming back to the idea behind this podcast, really serving the listener from a tactical point of view, breaking it down. When you think about centering relationships, when you're thinking through the folks you work with, either as peers, as grantees, et cetera, you're looking at those relationships. You're thinking about this as a meaningful, productive, authentic relationship. What do they look like? What are the rhythms, the dynamics, the cadence? What are you saying in those conversations that you're not saying otherwise?
Yeah, this one's hard because practically my day is broken into a series of, 30-minute to 1 hour Zoom calls. And it is very easy to fall into a transactional cadence of a rhythm of business. And so it's constantly push and pull. It's me showing up in any dialogue with a grantee or even a prospective grantee, like asking them to hold me accountable for the things that I offer to help you with, hold me accountable for showing up for you in this relationship. And there's a power dynamic there. And so trying to be really explicit about, I acknowledge that this power dynamic exists. I want to do everything we can within the bounds of what's legally and ethically permissible to subvert that power dynamic. So I'm asking grantees, like, how do we utilize the platform and the brand of the institution that I work for to further your goals and your work? Like, this shouldn't be about me, the funder. Our relationship shouldn't be about me and my portfolio and the story that I'm trying to tell to my board of trustees about what I accomplished. The story needs to be about your work and what your work makes possible for your community. But in reality, there's always a push and pull there. So what I try to do is just get into a very explicit and trusting rapport with all of my grantees and everyone I'm in a relationship with. That's like, okay, acknowledge that there's a power dynamic, acknowledge that we're going to be having to move quickly because we're all very busy people. And within that, how can we be as explicit and candid with each other about what's uncomfortable, what's hard, what's not working, what needs to be revisited, what needs to be reimagined. And I do better and worse with that in different relationships and in different dynamics. And so it's not the case that I feel like 100% of my grantee relationships are perfectly cultivated and well nurtured, but on balance, I try to do better than worse. But it's hard. It's really hard.
Yeah. I want to, if I can, dive a bit further into what Kelly said, though, around this notion of the energy, the excitement, the way in which the relationship is structured. Perhaps an example, you've got 3 new meetings. At the end of the day, you're reflecting back on the first one. You're really excited about it. The second one, you're kind of disinterested. And the third, you felt not only disinterest, but kind of almost disgust and resentment. Pretending that they're all talking about the same thing in the same way. Like, what's your passion? What's your soft spot? How am I going to lose you? How am I going to get you?
Yeah, so I'm always looking for humility around the problem space. Like, if something's going to turn me off right away, it's sort of solutionism. Often that shows up as techno-solutionism in the funding space that I'm in, but just the idea that here's a particular, complex, messy social problem, we can solve it and here's how we're going to do it. For some people that might read as a can-do attitude. For me, that reads as a real lack of humility. So I'm really looking to be in conversation with folks who are right-sized about the intervention that they think they can put into the problem space. This is another very fractal issue because I think we could talk about it at the level of entire sectors and industries, but social justice problems, these are not solvable problems. They're what we would call wicked problems. That is a term I picked up in the military. It's from a 1973 paper called General Dilemmas in a Theory of Planning. And it basically says that there's types of problems in society that we shouldn't even call problems. We certainly shouldn't pretend are solvable by the sort of same means that solve an engineering problem or an infrastructure problem. They're problems that are hard to define. They're often nested, systemic problems that are nested within bigger systems. As soon as you have defined the problem, you've constrained the universe of possible interventions or solutions to that problem. As soon as you try a solution, you've changed the problem shape. And so I would say most of the problems that we're facing as a society at this point are these wicked problems, whether it's, climate or social justice problems or any other issues that we face. Certainly the ones that we're trying to tackle in philanthropy and in social justice philanthropy are wicked problems. And so I'm actually really turned off by even the assumption or the suggestion that we're going to solve these problems, and certainly that we're going to solve them through technology. And so when I'm talking to somebody, I'm looking to get in the weeds with them of how they're defining the problem, what specific communities they're interested in supporting to grapple with the problem. And then I'm really looking for the language about how we muddle through together. I think usually the best thing we can do in light of these problems is to get into structures that are fostering better relationships to muddle through these issues together. I'd be most excited about a prospective grantee who's coming with some real humility around this is the piece of the problem that we think we can bite off. This is the broader community and ecosystem that it's embedded with and that we're partnered with in pursuit of systems change here. And then this is what we think can be different as a result. And I'm looking for some real humility across that story. That's going to be much more compelling for me than somebody who's here's this particular problem that I've developed a piece of software that's going to solve it for us.
If I was running you through and having that conversation, where are you going to get frustrated? Where are you going to get bored? So you mentioned the arrogance behind my idea that I'm pitching as a quick exit for you, not recognizing the true complexity and longevity of the problem sets. How about like the speed at which I speak, what I assume you know or don't know, questions, not questions? Am I walking you through my project planner? Am I riffing with you about how the world works?
I think this is, as I'm saying it out loud, I'm like, what a privilege. I rarely get bored. But I would say there's definitely things that will lose me. One of the through lines of my career has been like a facility for jargon translation. There's sets of jargon that I associate with institutions and movements that I know aren't for me, right? And so like effective altruism is one of these where I've learned enough about it that I can listen for the jargon. And if I'm hearing it, I'm like, oh, this person's coming from a dramatically different worldview than I am. There's nothing wrong with that, but this conversation probably isn't for me. And I can make suggestions to them about the types of funders who are going to be open to hearing from them through that lens and through that worldview. But it's probably not for me.
Right. And I could see that through line between the EA distaste and the idea that problems can be wicked and intractable, or if I'm using that word correctly at the same time, because this idea that you can quantify and make comparative evaluations. For what it's worth, the most viral tweet that I have ever tweeted was a rant about EA. So I'm deeply with you on that front. It's a lot of fun.
You know, I was reminded a few minutes ago of one of my favorite tweets ever, which was normalize leaving people in whatever reality they've chosen.
That's awesome. Kelly, I have some other follow-ups, but did you want to dive in? I still feel like there was a core of like, what does authenticity feel like? Maybe in your initial question, or how can we recognize the inevitability of relationships and connection as being part of this work as opposed to controllable?
Yeah, and I think, if you haven't created those authentic relationships, then it's kind of on the fundraiser to say, like, can I show up as my authentic self?
Yeah, well, this probably goes back to that I appreciate humility, but I'm always a fan of someone showing up and saying like, hey, look, I read your bio, I read your team's strategy page, and I'm going to be honest, it's all landing as a lot of jargon for me. And can I tell you where I'm at and where I'm coming from and what my work is? And then maybe you can do the same and like, let's try to meet somewhere in the middle. I often find that that's like a totally fair starting point. Like just be explicit about the fact that you're not sure if there's a fit here, but that you'd like to explore together whether there might be.
I love that.
And in practice, they might come and say, hey, I think there might be an argument here, but would you be game to just play it out with me and see if there's something there? I'm really open to that. And like, I can guarantee that a conversation that starts that way, it might not end with me saying, I'm going to write you a check, but it definitely will end or result in me trying to be helpful to them. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to make an argument that this is a fit for my strategy, but I know this other person who I bet would be really interested in what you're doing. Or, hey, do you know this other organization that's playing in a somewhat complementary space and maybe you should be partnered with them? Or, hey, have you actually thought about the ways in which what you're describing is participatory grant making or emergent strategy or this other piece of jargon that you might not have ever heard of. But if you become fluent in it, it's going to open up a whole nother universe of funding possibilities for you. So I actually really think it's a strong starting point for an authentic relationship when a grantee or a prospective grantee kind of shows up saying like, hey, I'm not sure I've like nailed my understanding of what you mean by this jargon, but like, can we game it out together?
Mm-hmm. That's a theme that comes up a lot in conversations, which is the gaming it out, the creation, even the word play. Well, let's play with it, see what happens, as opposed to, yes, please walk me through your deck, right? So again, extremely tactically, putting ourselves in the shoes of a listener. They know of you, they have no relationship with you. How are they getting your attention? I think if you were at a conference and they come up to you next to you at the coffee table, like what are they saying in that moment that's going to like capture your interest versus have you try to find a friend to go talk to somewhere else?
Yeah. And it's often not, I know walking up to me in a coffee shop is a throwaway example, but it's often like they're pinging me on LinkedIn, right? And the worst ones say, hey, Michelle, I saw you do strategic tech. Like, did you know about my organization to increase nonprofit uptake of generative AI tools?
Right.
Or do you know about the best CRM I've ever developed for philanthropy? So like you can tell when someone has taken the most cursory look at your information and developed their opening pitch based on that. If you took 5 more minutes or even 5 more seconds to scroll down in my page and see that I'm a critical technologist, not an IT person, that I went from being a tech fellow to work on the Tech and Society team. If you clicked on any post that I've written in the last 10 years. And so the best messages come from, it could be a high school student, it could be a job seeker, it could be a prospective grantee, but they've done like 2 minutes of research on me
Right.
and they've found something to connect with me on. Oh, I saw that you love this book. Oh, I saw that you wrote an article about wearable technology and dance music. Find anything to connect with me over,
Yeah.
and I will take a meeting with you. I will take a meeting with anybody who wants to talk to me, as long as they did like the modicum of basic research to have a starting point for an interesting conversation with me. Just do the barest level of, beyond looking at my actual title, do like one layer deeper research to reveal something that we might be able to connect over. And then like just be explicit that you'd like my advice, or you're looking for mentors, or you're hoping I might consider funding you. And I probably will take the meeting. That's
Cool.
just me. Some people have better boundaries, and more power to them.
It was interesting because part of what we talk about and we try to seed with folks is this idea that we are in this together. We're on the same side of the table, that no one has all of the forms of power and agency required to pull things off. And a lot of the time when someone is engaging with a funder, there's an anxiety and a fear and a supplication that kicks in. Philanthropy matters within philanthropy. And so that's an interesting set of impediments, if you would, that you need to help overcome. It's interesting.
Yeah, and philanthropy loves the idea of narrative. What is the story that people can come around? And I think a lot of that grappling is like a grappling for relevance and a grappling for being a part of something bigger than itself, like philanthropy being a part of something bigger than itself, consistent also with like something I've grappled with throughout my life, understanding that the sort of like default values framework that has led to amazing things like the agricultural and industrial revolutions, like isn't necessarily the highest and best story about humanity that we could be telling. And so I think philanthropy loves narrative because it's a way of getting outside of itself, but also bringing its values into a more mainstream conversation.
Well, I want to extend a huge thank you from us to you, to your willingness to show up, be candid, have this conversation. It means a lot to us, especially the ability to sort of pull back the curtain a little bit and get into the details. So a huge amount of appreciation for us. It's been a fun conversation. And I also want to extend you a bit of a compliment. I just wanted to recognize that you are actually truly a partner in that front to a lot of the folks that we know and work with in common.
Well, thank you, Jeffrey. And that means a lot coming from you. Thank you for all of the work that you do.
Thank you. Kelly, any final thoughts?
For me, I just appreciate the intentionality of which you go about your work. I think being thoughtful, self-reflective, and intentional are like the three things that came across in our conversation. I think we can have values that we try to live into, but then can you say like, what are the actual steps that I took to live into those values? And can I point to specific practices? And I really do believe those came across in the conversation today. So thank you. Thanks to Michelle Shevin for bringing such clarity, curiosity, and generosity to the conversation, and for reminding us that funders can be reflective, creative, and real.
If you want to go deeper into this work, power, relationship, strategy, and how money really moves, you can check out our workshops at aspirationtech.org/HDRM.
Funders on Fundraising is co-produced by Chris Lawrence, plus Decca Hussein Wetzel and Andrew Calloway of Urbanist Media. Editing and mixing also by Urbanist Media. It is hosted by me, Kelly James of Education First Consulting.
And me, Jeffrey McDougall of Aspiration. Our cover art is by Ben Johnson, and our theme music is by Evan Greer.
This podcast is a production of Aspiration.
This content is for educational and entertainment purposes only. The views expressed are those of